diagnosed as autistic.
Autism.
Being autistic.
I'm autistic.
Autistic person.
Taking an autism diagnosis is hard.
There's something really worrying about society in 2025 because it seems that everywhere we look, people are talking about autism and the fact that suddenly now they are autistic. Why is it that there is such a social contagion around autism? It's as if it has become a trend and everybody now wants to become autistic. Well, at least that's according to TikTok. It's true that there's more information about autism than ever before, whether it's YouTube channels, TikTok creators, authors, even TV documentaries seem to be discussing autism constantly. But why is that? That is exactly what I'm going to be breaking down in today's video to explain to you exactly why so many people are being diagnosed as autistic. If you don't know me, my name's Ellie and I was diagnosed as autistic last year at the age of 25. So I'm going to try and explain this the best that I can from my personal experience, as well as giving you the history on autism. So let's jump into it and start with the deep dive about autistic history. And please excuse the lighting, it's currently golden hour and this is the only place in my house to film. Scientists began to take interest in the idea of autism at the start of the 1900s, and the term autism was first used in 1908 by Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler, I hope I'm saying that right, to explain a symptom of schizophrenia, which he described as a detachment from reality together with the relative and absolute predominance of the inner life. And later in the 1920s, there were psychological studies expanding the idea of what autism was, mainly by Russian child psychiatrist Grunya Sakharova, which widely described autism in the way that we look at it today, including showing autistic people to have restricted hyperfixated interests, social difficulties and sensory difficulties. However, her studies were not actually published into English until 1996. Other psychologists around the same time did similar studies on autism. However, arguably the one that has had the biggest impact on autism up until recently is Hans Asperger, who in the 1940s began doing some research of his own into autism, and he was involved in a very specific group of Germans in the 1940s. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. Asperger did some very unethical studies on autistic children during the 1940s, mainly autistic boys, and tried to distinguish between the helpful and unhelpful autistics within society. The helpful ones were described as having Asperger syndrome and were usually autistic people who had higher IQs or less noticeable social difficulties, which meant that they could then be used within society and go into the workplace, whereas the ones that weren't seen as helpful within society were sent off to certain camps where they would never be seen again. And these people were what we would now consider to be high support needs autistics, i.e. those autistics in society who need the most amount of support from the wider world, like their parents, families or carers. It was due to Asperger's research that autism was seen as a distinct condition from Asperger syndrome. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but for now let's fast forward to 1980, which is when the term autistic disorder was first used within the DSM-3. And for anybody who doesn't know, the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is written by psychologists in the USA, listing all of the different mental health conditions and disorders that can be diagnosed. It described autism as a pervasive developmental disorder. However, at the time, the criteria for autism was very, very strict. It wasn't a spectrum like it is today, but a very strict, specific criteria that you needed to fit all of in order to get diagnosed, meaning that there was no nuance in how them traits could actually present. Due to some criticisms of it, it was then amended in 1987 and included the term mild autism. It was also around this time that we saw the first confirmed autistic character within a movie, which was Rain Man, an autistic male who had an amazing memory for detail but also had social struggles. But what most people didn't realise is not only Rain Man based on somebody autistic, but also somebody with Savant syndrome, which is its own distinct condition and has its own diagnostic criteria, blurring the lines on what people really believed autism presented like, and meant that many people thought that autism presented exactly the way that Raymond was in the Rain Man movie, leading to a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding on the variety of ways that autism can present.
First person with Asperger's.
When the DSM-4 was released in 1994, it replaced the term mild autism with Asperger syndrome. I told you this would be relevant again, and saw it as a distinct condition from autism itself. But all this did was create an us and them mentality, where people with Asperger's syndrome didn't believe that they were autistic. And this is why you hear the term Aspie supremacy today, because the only difference between what they termed Asperger's syndrome and autism was the severity of how them traits presented from the outside, and didn't take into consideration things like masking, which we now understand.
So what impact did the DSM-4 have on our understanding of autism? The answer: a huge amount. And I think this was a big reason why we've had such a spike in recent years of autism diagnoses, because the DSM-4 created a whole load of misinformation.
It did lead to a lot more studies on autism, but some of these were not positive. For example, psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen, and yes, you do recognise that name, because he is in fact the cousin of Borat. Baron-Cohen researched the idea of the extreme male brain, which again, to an extent, Hans Asperger influenced, due to the fact that he recognised that most autistic traits were displayed in males. Baron-Cohen's studies on gender differences in autism were based around the idea that autistic traits came from a male-centred brain, and saw a link between the way that males act and autistic traits. He also blamed an increase in male hormones during pregnancy as to why there were female autistics, and spread misinformation that autism was mainly a male condition.
Naughty, naughty.
This has since been debunked, and it's been found that 86% of studies on gender differences on autism were actually conducted by Baron-Cohen himself. And honestly, I have got a bit of beef with him, because all this did was spread this idea that only boys could be autistic. So the minute that also autistic girls displayed any autistic traits, we got stuck with labels like shy or bossy, instead of people actually investigating why we struggled. It's even been found that to this day, 95% of autistic studies have been conducted on males, which just goes to show the bias on autism research. Yes, more autistic males are diagnosed than autistic females, but that isn't because there are more autistic males than females. It's just because we are so good at recognising autistic boys in a way that we aren't good at recognising autistic females.
Luckily, psychologists resolved a lot of the issues created by the DSM-4 when they released the DSM-5 in 2013. And this finally gets to why we've started to see an increase in diagnoses today. DSM-5
did a lot of good to try and explain how autism can present in females, and it even now includes a section talking about masking autism. And for anybody that doesn't know, autistic masking is any behaviour done as an attempt to hide autistic traits. That could be from forcing eye contact even though it makes you feel uncomfortable. It could be trying not to react to sensory sensitivities so you didn't look strange for putting your hands over your ears, or it could be learning the rules of social situations in order to fit in and seem more normal compared to everybody else.
And this recognition of autistic masking within the DSM-5 suddenly meant that those autistics whose traits weren't as obvious were suddenly recognised as what they were, and that they were still autistic traits even though they were attempting to hide them.
And guess who is most likely to do that autistic masking? You guessed it,
Autistic girls and women.
So as a result of the way that autism had been portrayed for so long by these scientific groups and communities, it meant that if even the scientists don't know about this, then how do we expect our parents to understand that we were autistic either? As I said before, I got stuck with labels like shy and bossy, even though I literally didn't have a clue how to socialise, to the point where my parents even had to take me to a drama class when I was about 4 or 5 to teach me how to talk to people, and my mum would actually coach me on social interactions. I just want to quickly say, if you are enjoying this video so far, then please consider subscribing, as it will help to support me as a small creator and means that I can create more videos like this talking about autism. I think that despite the fact that the DSM was actually updated in 2013, it has taken quite a few years for this information to thaw out and defrost, and for the wider population to actually take on this new definition of what autism is. Because now, instead of us having this one condition of Asperger's syndrome and this one condition of autism, it is just autism spectrum disorder. And yes, them traits can present differently from one autistic person to another autistic person, but we still have the shared experiences
of dealing with social difficulties.
And if you're anything like me, feeling as if everybody else had this manual to life that you had never received.
Side note, if you are in the process of understanding your own autistic traits, then I've created an autism diagnostic guide, which is linked at the top of the description, breaking down the full diagnostic criteria. It includes over 300 examples of how autism can present and space to include your own autistic traits. Future Ellie here. One other thing that I forgot to mention while filming this was that in 2013, when the DSM-5 was updated, it was also updated to reflect the fact that ADHD and autism were two distinct conditions, because up until that point, you could not be diagnosed as autistic and ADHD. It was either one or the other, whereas we now know how commonly they co-occur. And when one of them conditions outweighs the other and seems more obvious, for example, you might have a child that has ADHD and autism, but because they seem really outgoing and impulsive, they got that ADHD diagnosis when really they actually had both. And the same in reverse as well. I've been diagnosed as autistic, however, I'm now seeking out an ADHD diagnosis. ADHD is a whole other thing, and we need to take that into account as well, because it means that suddenly now, all these people who could only be diagnosed with one condition are suddenly being diagnosed with two because they are so comorbid.
You must stay at home.
So, bringing us to the 2020s then, it definitely feels like in the last few years, that is when it's really ramped up in terms of the discussions about autism online.
Something I've not heard many people talk about is the fact that COVID was such a catalyst to so many people getting an autism diagnosis, because what other period in time have we been completely isolated from the outside world, unable to socialise and not have any kind of sensory stimulation, to suddenly being back in the outside world again, exposed to all of these things that we'd forced ourselves to get used to. And not only that, but I feel like lockdown gave so many people time to reflect on themselves and look inwards at who they truly are. I myself became a mum 5 weeks before we went into the first lockdown, and it was the most humbling experience ever to go into this situation where I couldn't have the support from my family that I needed to have, and go into a complete state of autistic burnout because I was a new mum who couldn't cope with the sudden overstimulation and constant need to look after a small child. Obviously, not many people are going to have the exact experience that I had. However, we need to look at how society has been impacted by such a huge event.
And it just so happens that this lockdown coincided with the sudden uprise in people downloading TikTok because they had nothing else to do. So not only have we got a group of people sat at home questioning their whole lives, but now people also have a platform to share their life experiences. So we all of a sudden are getting everybody blaming TikTok on the reason that people are being diagnosed as autistic, when really it's just that people are sharing their experiences on this new platform at a time when everybody was sat at home anyway. So it's not that people have been diagnosed because of TikTok or because of social media or any kind of social contagion. It is literally just the fact that we now have this understanding on autism that we have never had before. What frustrates me is that nobody ever considers the history of autism, like I've touched on today, as a contributing factor and the cause of so much misinformation for so long that we are now suddenly debunking. It's not that suddenly everyone is autistic, it's just that suddenly everybody actually understands what autism is. I truly believe that after everybody talking about autism on TikTok, it created this huge media shift where suddenly TV companies like the BBC wanted to talk about autism too, especially with the big conversations about mental health that have happened since lockdown, not just because of COVID, but also because of people like Caroline Flack, who died just before the first COVID lockdown. And these conversations about mental health really coincide with the conversations about autism, because so many autistics, especially the ones that are late diagnosed, have really struggled with their mental health. These media companies did jump on the bandwagon of talking about autism, but that wasn't for the bad, because look at where we are now and how many people are finally understanding themselves.
Without this rise of the media talking about autism in the last few years, I would never have realised that I was autistic. I just thought for so long that I was broken and there wasn't actually an answer to all the struggles that I'd always had. That was until Christy McGuinness released her documentary Here in in the UK, talking about her experiences as a late diagnosed autistic, and suddenly it clicked that if this is what autism is, then I'm definitely autistic. And just because my autism doesn't present the same way as Raymond's or Sheldon Cooper's does, that does not make me any less autistic. So yes, it's okay to an extent to question this change, but I think it's really invalidating to the experiences of autistics to say that suddenly everyone wants to be diagnosed, or that it's just suddenly a trend. Because at the end of the day, autistic people who are late diagnosed have been failed by the wider scientific community, who up until recently haven't wanted to recognise the fact that women can also be autistic and that their experiences just appear differently. I could do a whole video just talking about why autistic women seem to be so different than autistic males, so if you want me to do a video about that, then please let me know. I hope this answers some of your questions about autism, and if you are late diagnosed or late realised with autism like myself, then I hope this has helped to reassure you that you are not wrong for seeking a diagnosis now, and it isn't your fault that it has taken so long for you to get diagnosed. If you have any questions or thoughts specific to this video, then please let me know, and I'll see you next week with another video talking about autism. Bye!